eller så byter vi bara plats.
Hello and welcome to the first of this term's series of the Exist seminars, where we look at existential issues and questions of the environmental humanities. We are three organisations at Uppsala University who host this series of seminars each term. I'm Martha Middlemiss Lemon. I'm director of the Centre for Multidisciplinary Research on Religion and Society, CRS, based at the Department of Theology. And with me today, I have Daniel Mossberg, who's a representative of CEMUS, who's also one of the organisations of the seminars. He's going to be appearing in sound later on as he handles questions from those of you who've got questions to our speaker later. With us organising these seminar series, we also have the Centre for Health and Sustainability, which is also based at Uppsala University. Those of you who've taken part in these seminars before know that we normally meet on site and eat our lunch together, but today we're trying a new concept. We're in the recording studio in Blåsenhus, which gives us the opportunity to try some new techniques and to preserve today's talk for posterity so that those people who couldn't join us can watch it afterwards. We are going to welcome questions both from those of you who are here. We're really glad that a few people have found their way to the studio to join us on site. Daniel will come round with a microphone if you've got any questions later. But those of you online are also welcome to ask questions afterwards via the chat function in Zoom. So write your questions in the chat and Daniel will read them up to us afterwards. So I think that's all the housekeeping I have for the moment. And so I don't want to take up any more time. I'm going to just briefly introduce our guest speaker for today, who is Professor Malcolm Fairbrother, Professor of Sociology here at Uppsala University and also researcher at the Future Studies Institute based in Stockholm. He's done a lot of work on the issue that he's going to talk to us about today, the politics of environmental policy making, is broadly speaking, but today we're going to focus on trust issues. Mm-hmm. And I will leave you to introduce yourself more in detail and to give us the benefit of your wisdom on these issues.
Thanks a lot.
Malcolm.
Thanks for the invitation. Some bits of my past will come out in the course of the presentation, actually, but suffice to say, yes, I'm an environmental sociologist, and I've been working on questions of sustainability for quite a long time. Let me jump right in and say that in the environmental social sciences, we tend to look at a lot of graphics along these lines. So here what you can see is one measure of environmental performance of different societies. So if we zero everyone into 1990 as a baseline and then compare what's happened since that point, on the issue of greenhouse gas emissions, there's quite a bit of variation. And I feel this rather keenly because I'm originally from Western Canada, but now live in Sweden. And as you can see in this graphic, Canada and Sweden are sort of, in quite different points on the performance scale. I also lived in the UK for 10 years, and the UK is a country that has done quite well in reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. Canada is literally still building new pipelines. However, I think if we get too focused on the performance of different societies in grappling with single problems, we can miss something, which I can show you by reference to this. So this is a timeline of emissions of three different things from the exact same source. Now here we've started rolling the clock from 1995, and what you can see are trend lines of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide, of course, is in the news a lot because that's the main reason we have climate change. And what you can see is that US power plants, in other words, places making electricity from burning coal, have actually reduced their emissions a bit, but only a bit, whereas they've reduced their emissions of sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides a lot, gotten rid of most of it. And we can sort of ask the question, well, how is it that they could do so well on two things and so poorly on another? And this is not just a US story or an electricity generation story. Here you can see how acid rain as a problem has changed over time, closer to home here in Europe. And this is partly a consequence of the kinds of technologies that were behind this change over time in the emissions of these other pollutants in the US as well. And one reaction to this is to say, well, that's just because we've moved all of our dirty industry, to China and other places in the world. But that's actually not true. So the world as a whole has dealt extremely well with the issue of sulfur in particular. Nitrogen oxides and acid rain globally are smaller problems than they used to be. And that's not even the biggest success story of all. Here you can see what's happened with ozone-depleting substances, which contributed to what was, when I was a kid, the scariest environmental problem of all, the depletion of the ozone layer. Without this protective layer in the upper atmosphere, we would have massively raised rates of skin cancer, and it would be a gigantic global problem. But in my lifetime, this went from being a really terrifying environmental problem to one that barely makes the news anymore because it's gone away. And the final example of an environmental success story I want to highlight is this one, which is even closer to home. So this shows you the lead content in children's blood in Sweden. Now, lead is something we want none of in our bodies. It's not something we want a trace amount or a small amount of. We'd like to have none. And it literally reduces the brain development of children. As you can see, the exposure of children in Sweden, and indeed in many countries, was a lot higher than it is now. And I always say I am a couple of IQ points stupider than I would have been if I had not been exposed to so much lead when I was little. So I don't want to deny the frightening environmental problems that confront the world today. Obviously, they're real, they're serious. Climate change is one of humanity's greatest failures. But if you want to find success stories, they're actually out there. And I think this raises the really huge social scientific question, which is, as I say, how can we have done so well on some things and so poorly, which we obviously have, on others? And that's part of what I want to grapple with a little bit in this talk today. But I also give these examples because I want to spread the word to more people that when we try, we actually succeed. We just don't actually try enough. And I think the world as a whole has not yet seriously tried to solve the problem of climate change. This was grappled with in a really nice way a year ago by the Canadian Minister of the Environment and of Climate Change, who was asked, Canada, well, it's not a complete failure as a society, in some ways does pretty well in international indices of health and performance of various sorts of things, education. Why has Canada been such a poor performer on climate change? And he said, in a moment of breathtaking honesty, because we never tried to actually do anything about it. And this illustrates the degree to which, from my perspective, environmental problems, including climate change, are predominantly political challenges and political choices. So I look at the world kind of like this. This is an extremely simplified visual representation of environmental politics as I see it. So the thing that saves the world or doesn't are the policies that governments choose to enact or not, which come out the right-hand side. And those are outcomes from three core influences, which I've represented here, or I should say four: industry, public opinion, public attitudes, voting, social movements, and then all of those things sort of passing through or refracted by state actors, so elected politicians, public officials, and so on. And there are definitely ways we could elaborate this diagram. And when I've presented this to different audiences, people have sometimes said to me, well, what about the role of science or the media? Politicians in turn speak back to the public and try to change their views and so on. I grant all of that, but as a heuristic, as a simplifying map, I like going with this. So let me say very briefly something about this part of the landscape, which is that I think one of the reasons why humanity has performed exceptionally poorly on climate change is that the fossil fuel industry has been unusually resistant to change. So in those success cases that I described to you, the industries that were predominantly causing the problems, in all cases, resisted for a period of time claims by the scientific community that what they were doing was causing harm. But eventually they relented. And I think they did so because they realized they could go on existing as profitable industries, profitable firms, even if they changed their practices to reflect the reality that their previous production processes were so environmentally damaging. But the fossil fuel industry has never really come around and accepted that it needs to change. And I think the reason for that is if you own a resource under the ground that is a fossil fuel, there's really nothing you can do with that value except burn it, which of course causes climate change. And so for them, the threat of regulation is existential in a way that it was not for other sorts of industries. So one of the key reasons I think humanity has failed so poorly, performed so poorly on climate change is specifically because of this exceptional level of industry resistance. But it's important to recognize this is not normal. So in other cases, the industries have actually eventually acknowledged the harm they were doing and, as I say, moved on. And did you notice, the world grappling with these other sorts of problems? Did you yourself make a big sacrifice or change something in your life to solve these other things, like getting rid of lead, dealing with acid rain, dealing with the ozone layer? No, actually, for most of us, almost all humans, these things basically happened in the background. But climate change is different. So next, I want to say a little bit about public attitudes. In fact, this is what I'm going to mostly focus on today. I'm really interested in people like this. People who are so hostile that they are actually willing to take time out of their days to go and protest against a policy measure that most climate policy experts, in fact, maybe all of them, would say is a really good way of solving this problem that confronts humanity, arguably the greatest problem confronting the world today. These people are so hostile to a carbon tax, raising the price of pollution to polluters so they do less of it, that they, as you can see, went out and actually protested against it. Now, these people were in Australia more than a decade ago. And as you may know, Australia has the distinction of being the only country that once had a carbon tax and then got rid of it because Australian voters elected a government that specifically promised in their campaign to get rid of the carbon tax that had previously been enacted. And this is a rather specific instance of a more generalized phenomenon, which was captured a little bit by this news article from The Economist not that long ago. The global backlash against climate policies has begun. And what The Economist was pointing out is that in a lot of different ways, governments have been discouraged from taking actions that they might otherwise have taken because public reactions to proposed climate solutions, and indeed to other environmental problems, has sometimes been quite negative. People are sometimes very hostile to doing things that we here in the sort of policy experts community at universities, for example, think is a really obvious step to take. And so that raises the question, why are people so hostile to things that could do so much good for the planet? Now, one possibility, particularly with climate change, you might say, is, well, maybe people don't believe in the problem. There is climate denial out there. As I mentioned, the fossil fuel industry has been very resistant. And one of the things the fossil fuel industry has done is tried to convince policymakers and the general public that climate change, isn't happening, isn't actually anthropogenic, isn't something to worry about, and so on. But actually, we have survey data from many, many countries. And in every country for which we have data now, we know that a majority of people, a strong majority of people, believe climate change is happening. slightly larger numbers of people think climate change is a mix of human-caused and natural. But by any measure, we have won the battle to convince people that climate change is real, it's anthropogenic, it's dangerous, and we've got people to worry about it. So I don't think the lack of public acceptance of measures to do things about climate change is due to skepticism about the problem. You can see Sweden is near the bottom of this graphic here next to Norway. It's one of the countries where actually people seem a little bit less concerned about climate change. But as I'll explain, that hasn't stopped Sweden from actually taking measures to do something about it. Here's results, if you can read the Swedish, that show the reason for some people's resistance to climate action. So this is a time series from a survey project conducted out of Gothenburg University, which you can see goes back to 1990, and has asked people continually over the years a survey question about supporting measures to protect the environment. And the interesting thing is, as you can see around 2009, 2010, they switched the question wording. And before that point, the question said, would you be in favor of doing more for the environment, even at the cost of reduced economic growth? And then after that point, they changed it to get rid of the reference to growth thing. And the major discontinuity in the lines here shows what an impact it has on people that solving climate change seems to involve a serious economic sacrifice. So part of the public resistance, I think, to doing something about climate change is that in contrast to those other environmental problems I mentioned before, we're actually asking people for something, right? So to solve the ozone layer, to solve acid rain, to solve the exposure to lead, which mostly came from lead in vehicle fuels, we didn't really have to ask ordinary people to change their lives or bear any kind of notable cost. In the case of climate change, we could have a conversation about how large the cost is, but I think there is some inconvenience, at least, that ordinary people have to accept if we're going to solve the problem. And this sort of survey evidence shows people don't seem at all willing to pay any kind of price, even to solve the problem of climate change, despite the fact, as I showed, people around the world accept that it's real. And if you ask them, they want their governments to do something about it. Somehow there's an unwillingness there to pay any kind of price. But the other part of the equation here that I want to focus on can be captured by this. So this is a picture of a gilet jaune, yellow vest protester. And you may recall that a little before the pandemic, there was a big wave of protests in France by these people wearing these yellow safety vests. And what they were protesting was a proposed increase in fuel taxes that was meant as a climate protecting measure. But in the eyes of the yellow vest protesters, this was deeply unfair, was not a proportional measure to take in terms of the benefits it would achieve. And they were really angry that the French government was proposing to do this. And then some of these protests even spread to other countries, including Sweden, though they were never so big as in France. But there's been research done on the yellow vests in the years since, and a really critical fact about them is that they were not predominantly climate deniers. So one of the initial reactions was, okay, these are maybe right-wing populist people who we know don't tend to believe in climate change, deny its seriousness as a problem or whatever. But actually that's not true. The yellow vest protesters, for the most part, said they were actually concerned about climate change. In fact, a lot of them said this was quite an important issue for them, but they really didn't believe that this proposed fuel tax increase was going to accomplish anything. So I grapple with this kind of phenomenon in my research. And let me show you a little bit how I think about this and why they were so opposed. So with some moral philosophers, I collaborated on a project in recent years about humanity's moral duties to future generations. what we owe to people who are not even born yet. And this is one paper that came out of this work. How do people grapple with the question of policy making or bearing a cost for future benefits? In other words, what should we do in terms of making decisions as societies that are going to have very long-term consequences? This obviously comes up a lot around climate change and other environmental topics because we're essentially doing things that will take a very long time to kind of play out. People who aren't even born yet will pay the price if we don't solve today's environmental problems. One of the questions we asked in a survey that we conducted in 4 different countries was this: to what extent would you be willing or not to reduce your standard of living so that people in the future can lead better lives on a scale from 0 to 10? We also asked people this question: in the future, how do you think most people's standards of living will probably change compared to today? Are they going to get a lot higher, get a lot lower, or something in between? We did this survey in 4 countries: Sweden, Spain, South Korea, and China. And one of the things that was very striking about the results was how much more optimistic the respondents in Asia, particularly in China, were compared to the respondents in Europe, even in Sweden. A lot of people in Sweden think that living standards in the future are going to go down, which would be a big change from, history of the last century plus. But the question for us was, how do we think about the relationship between people's answers to those 2 questions I just showed you? From one point of view, we should expect people who expect living standards to go up to be less willing to sacrifice for future generations. This is a logic of what economists call discounting. So if we knew that people who come after us were going to be richer than us, we would quite legitimately not feel obligated to give them as much. Why would we? They're going to be richer than us. We don't normally give charity to people who are better off than ourselves. We normally give charity to people who are worse off than ourselves. So from this logic, which economists have wrapped into the entire way they think about intergenerational distribution, we would expect respondents to our survey to give lower answers on their willingness to sacrifice insofar as they give higher answers to their question about future standards of living. But there's another way to think about the relationship between these 2 questions. And that's this, which is, if you think the world is full of corrupt, incompetent, lying, malevolent actors running big institutions in government, in media, corporations, universities, churches, unions, you name it, then you would expect the world to go downhill. You would expect things to go badly. You would expect there to be a decline in future standards of living. And why would you sacrifice? It will just be wasted. You will be a sucker. Your money will disappear into corrupt institutions, and the privileged, well-connected few will disappear with what you've tried to give future generations. On the other hand, if you have a positive view of the world where basically public officials and public institutions and even private institutions more or less do what they say, try to do their jobs well, are mostly honest and not that corrupt, then you probably have a positive view about where the world is going. You probably expect future generations will be better off than us because gradually humanity will solve problems, invent new technologies, and so on. And if you make a contribution to those future generations, it will succeed. It will actually benefit them. And from this point of view, there should be a positive relationship between these 2 variables. So, which did we find? Absolutely the latter. In all 4 countries, we found that people who expect future living standards to go up were more willing to sacrifice for future generations. They were more supportive of policies for benefiting future generations, and that was either with respect to the climate or even reducing public debt. They were more trusting in major social institutions, and they were more confident that policies would actually yield the benefits their advocates say. What we have found in research of various different kinds is that trust, particularly trust in public institutions, public authorities, policymakers, public administrators, and so on, is really, really central to people's views of many different solutions for environmental problems. We have basically convinced the world to worry about the problems, but we have not convinced the world about the solutions, and that's mostly because of public distrust and cynicism. So let me show you this another way in another study I conducted with collaborators at Umeå University. We used data from across 23 European countries. It was collected almost a decade ago in an initiative called the European Social Survey. This is the best quality survey data you can get in Europe, effectively. And this survey asked people, to what extent are you in favor or against a short series of policies in your country to reduce climate change? And one of them was also increasing taxes on fossil fuels. Survey asks people also about their beliefs and awareness. Do you think the Earth's climate is changing? Do you think climate change is due to natural processes, human activity, or both? And how good or bad do you think the impacts of climate change will be? And the survey asked a series of questions about people's trust in major political institutions, parliament, politicians, and political parties in their countries. Pooling across the 23 countries that were included in the survey, what we found is overwhelming acceptance that the climate is changing, that it's due to humans predominantly, although there were a lot of people who thought it was both natural and anthropogenic equally. And most people are convinced it will be really bad. But the support for raising taxes on fossil fuels was much, much weaker. So there's a clear divide between people's concerns about climate change and what they're willing to support in terms of a policy action to address climate change. But here's the key thing. If we take the average support for increasing taxes on fossil fuels on the vertical axis here, and then we take the average level of belief and concern about climate change on the horizontal axis, and we plot the 23 countries' averages against each other, there's no relationship at all. Spain is the country that reported the highest level of belief in the danger of climate change. Russia is at the other end of the spectrum. But if we array support for increasing fossil fuel taxes against political trust, the correlation across these 23 countries is 0.86. And in the social sciences, a correlation of 0.86 is almost unheard of. This is as strong as relationships get in the social sciences. So what you can see is that support for doing this key thing to address climate change is actually mostly rooted in people's relationships to the institutions in their country. And we found that individuals in high trust countries are more supportive of doing things about climate change if they believe in the problem, whereas in people with low trust, people in low trust countries, basically even if they believe in the problem, they don't support the solutions. So let me just conclude by talking very briefly about a really fantastic Swede, Greta Thunberg, who I think has done a tremendous amount in recent years to draw attention to the issue of climate change, to mobilize people, to inspire people. I guess in the last year or two, she's sort of fallen off the front page a little bit. But I think she's done fantastic work, except in one respect, which is a little bit captured by this New York Times feature on her. Greta Thunberg has given up on politicians. What does she say when people confront her with policy actions, international debate, claims that some countries are doing certain things to deal with climate change? She says it's all blah, blah, blah. And I think that's actually a very damaging message for the reason I've shown you here today. Distrust and cynicism in the policy process and in institutions in Sweden or elsewhere, I think is actually very demoralizing and discouraging and actually prevents us getting closer to winning the public support that is so important for actually solving climate change in the way that we've solved past environmental challenges. Cynicism and dismissal of the political system and policy making, I think will just leave us nowhere where we're going to get the kind of action that we actually need if we're going to solve these problems. So we have to hold these two contradictory thoughts simultaneously. Politicians have failed us. Let's be honest. They have failed us so far. But we have to believe that they can actually do better. I'll stop there and we can have some discussion.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. Come and join me over here, and we'll, I'm sure, have plenty of questions. Daniel, have you got some questions already from over there? Otherwise,
no, I'm just getting prepared, both for the chat and also for the audience here. So.
Okay, well, do send your questions in, because we've got a quarter of an hour now for a bit of a discussion. And it would be a shame if it was only me who got to ask the questions. So go on. There's so many things that we could talk about from what you said. It's really interesting. But I'll just grab on a couple of things that relate to things I've been thinking about. One thing I thought you talk about at the country level, but I've also been interested in within Sweden in recent years when there have been protests and things about this level of distrust in terms of, Stockholm being a unit within Sweden. And I don't know if you've looked at that to any extent, but I was just wondering, this idea of unfairness, do you see that within countries as well as this sort of institutional support?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of, it's absolutely a divide within societies. So in some of this work I've done, we did another survey actually in Sweden and some European countries a couple of years ago, and looking at the different kinds of people who have different views of different kinds of policies. The polarization in different European societies is in many ways very similar, no matter where you look. Sweden is not necessarily so unusual in this. So, there are political parties in basically all European countries now that have the message, you can't trust the media, you can't trust the government, you can't trust universities. Their message is you really can't trust anybody except us.
Yeah.
And those parties and their sympathizers are universally the most hostile towards climate policies. So here I gave a couple of really clear examples when it came to taxes, but actually it applies more broadly. So, whether we're talking about banning internal combustion engine cars, mandates around using heat pumps, that's been very politicized in some European countries. There's a tremendous amount of resentment against impositions in these sorts of domains. And yet it's not clear that we can really solve climate change without taking these kinds of steps. But people have the sense that it's very unfair, it's being imposed from the center. And one of the things that I think is quite interesting is if you look at the distributional implications within societies of many of these policies, people have this idea that it's going to be very costly, for the little guy. And actually, in many cases, that's simply not true. I mean, a lot of these technologies are actually phenomenally energy saving. So yes, there's some upfront price to pay, like for an electric car as opposed to a fossil fuel powered car, but over the life cycle of the products, solar panels, heat pumps, electric vehicles, they're cheaper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think and the example I was thinking of when I asked the question was this, the sort of protests about regarding fuel prices and taxes on fuel in Sweden. And when you get the sort of people in the countryside saying, yeah, but we need our car in a way that people in the city don't, you just don't understand and this idea of it being a bigger impact on my life than it would be on like somebody who lives in.
So I think, there's a grain of truth in what they're saying. But I mean, I think part of it is in for example, more remote parts of Sweden, like also in other countries, there's going to be a place for the automobile for the foreseeable future. I just think we know that electric vehicles are good vehicles. I think people have not fully taken on board that it's really not that big of a deal to switch to an electric vehicle. And even if you do live in a remote part of Sweden, those vehicles are totally usable. But the perception of some of these being kind of edicts that come from out of touch political leaders, capital cities or Brussels or whatever, I agree with you, it's there. But I think the underlying reality is not as in terms of the economics and the technological feasibility, I think many people have exaggerated it in their minds. And some of these kind of political forces have really done a lot to kind of intensify that perception.
Have you got other questions? Because I can carry on.
I just have a comment
Yeah.
from the chat. So it's from Astrid Bakal. Thanks. I agree with the findings. We're aware at Fridays for Future about the politicians' failure and eventually regain trust. It's not really a question, but a comment.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, I'm interested in how you kind of grapple with this, because I think it is a kind of messaging dilemma. I guess I would say so I'm a member of Researchers Desk, which has worked with Fridays for Future as a sort of scientific community to provide useful information and resources to campaign groups, including Fridays for Future. And I would say the criticism is totally warranted. We need the criticism. But I'm sometimes a little bit concerned that people don't actually acknowledge the successes that are out there. And I worry that if politicians who actually do the right thing don't get the credit they deserve for doing the right thing, we actually take the incentive away for them to do more of the right things. So relentless criticism for not being perfect, even if in one sense is warranted, I do think that protest groups sometimes are actually damaging their own cause. Also by not acknowledging the variation, the very first slide I showed, like I said, I'm from Western Canada. Canada is an atrocious climate performer. I mean, it's really bad. Sweden is not doing enough. But if all the world was doing what Sweden is doing or has done, the world would be in a much better place. Now, I realize that's an awkward kind of message, but I think it's important to kind of emphasize the solutions are out there, and countries like Sweden have actually shown, you can have a cold climate and you can have a high standard of living society and yet still massively reduce your greenhouse gas emissions to the point where, Sweden's per capita greenhouse gas emissions are, in a lot of ways quite low. And I think it should be more of a sort of example to other societies.
I think one thing I'm hearing you saying, which it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this, is that one of the most important things we can do in terms of trying to affect the climate debate at the moment is to work to restore faith in institutions in society. I mean, we think we often look at the concrete. Okay, how can we work for more? But am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah,
about that sort of.
I mean, this is also a tricky thing, and I'm not saying it's always easy to get this right. I'm not saying that public institutions deserve our blind trust. I'm not saying that public institutions have always done well. In a lot of countries in the world, obviously there are dictatorships, there are atrocities, corruption is widespread. I mean, there's a lot of problems, and nowhere is perfect, including Sweden. So we need to keep up the vigilance, we need to keep up the criticism. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that, people get educated, people get surgeries, roads get built. A lot of things in society actually work astoundingly well. And that's even true in, lower income countries with some corruption. It's not all bad. And I think that it's a very easy thing to just tear it all down. But what we need is to build it up, and not do so in a way that denies the problems. But I mean, I do think sometimes people have this idea that it's just kind of hopeless and politicians do nothing right. And I'm like, life expectancy is above 80. Everybody's literate. I mean, these are huge human accomplishments. So, let's not dismiss those.
I think you make an interesting point as well. I think coming from the Swedish context where as you pointed out, and we know from other studies, we're a high trust society, not just in politicians, but traditionally there's a lot of trust in other institutions in the society. But it's also, there's a downward trend even in the Swedish context over recent years. So I think for me, thinking about this is an interesting issue about not just the politicians, but also other organizations that traditionally have been able to be a voice in these issues that we don't trust as much as we used to. I think one very pertinent issue we could have a whole seminar on in the future is the issue at the moment of the Church of Sweden and how it looks after its forests. And a really big infected debate. And I think one thing that interests me there is not just, what decisions do they make in the future about how they look, but the way that debate impacts people's faith in the church as an organisation which can speak out on environmental issues in the future. And so I think what you've been saying today, I've sort of had that in the back of my head while I've been talking about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime institutions actually violate the trust that has been placed in them, it is very damaging, and I think that's why we continue to need to hold people to account. I would also say, since you brought up the issue of forests, I've been very sort of pro-Sweden in this, but when we turn from climate change to sort of nature protection, I mean, this country, I always say this country cuts trees the way that most of the world cuts grass. I mean, the cycling through forests and tree plantations, which is really maybe a more accurate term, is quite dramatic in this country. And I think Sweden has not reacted very well, for example, to European level authorities, essentially saying Sweden is butchering nature. So I don't want to take Sweden totally off the hook for some of its environmental management. Let's put it that way. But I completely agree with your take and the question of, well, how do institutions, rebuild the trust when they lose it?
Thank you. Daniel, have you got one? We've got a few more minutes left.
Yeah, we got a few more minutes, so quick questions and quick answers. So one from Alexander Hellquist. Thanks for an interesting lecture. Given that Sweden already has a high level of trust by international comparison, what avenues do you see for increasing it further?
I think there's a danger in Sweden that some of the sort of socioeconomic divides in this country could get larger and are already kind of eroding trust. I mean, like you said, there's already been somewhat of a decline. This is a very egalitarian country in terms of income. It's not a very egalitarian country when it comes to wealth. And I've just been teaching some students about this, but wealth inequality in Sweden by the standards of high-income democracies it's one of the most unequal societies there are, actually. And, this country got rid of its wealth tax, got rid of its inheritance tax. I think the risk of some of the resentment around wealth inequality turning into distrust in major institutions is quite real. So in the long term, I would say I think Sweden needs to come to terms with the question of wealth inequality and the kind of social divides that's contributing to. In the shorter term, I do think simply messaging more around existing social successes, as I mentioned before, is warranted. And I think there's some evidence that insofar as we point out to people, look, did you think about the fact that, maternal mortality has come down dramatically in a couple of generations. Gay people can live lives with dignity and freedom in a way they could not before. There's a lot of things that have improved. There's a lot of things that are actually very good. There's a lot of institutions in Sweden that perform extremely well. And I think we need to sort of reward those successes and draw attention to them a little more. And I think that will build trust.
We have a comment, but if you want to have a last question, Marta, go ahead.
No, go ahead, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, it's one of our collaborators, Sofia Oreland. So she writes, "Thanks for the presentation. As a scholar of religion and climate, I'd like to widen the concept of trust. My research finds that trust in the transcendent can liberate sacrifices and climate actions, including activism and advocacy. Furthermore, that climate anxiety, partly due to lack of trust in institutions, can be powerful motivating factors for climate commitment."
Okay. I would have to read the details to know more about that. I think fear and concern about the problem is definitely an important motivator. I would not question that. But I think we also need to grapple with fear and anxiety as paralyzing. So I would maybe push back just a little bit on some of the suggestion in the comment and say that I try to give these positive examples of problems we've solved because I think it gives us a sense of control and a sense of potential and a sense of proportion about how hard other environmental problems are to solve. I actually think climate change is an eminently solvable problem. Economically, technically, we could do it. It would not require us upending our lives. And I want people to have that sense of perspective that we should do that. I want people to be afraid, but I don't want to build the problem into something even bigger than it actually is.
Thank you. And we have to stop there, but it's quite a good note to end on, trying not to make it worse than it is. So thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you very much, Malcolm, for giving us your time and the benefits of your research. And to anyone who's been interested in today, then there'll be 2 more seminars in this series this term, on the 6th of March and the 8th of May, and more details on those will follow on CEMUS website. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.